My name is David Michael Christy. I was born in Fleetwood on the 12th of April 1946. Unfortunately for me, I was a war baby. My mother Barbara gave birth to me at Milton Lodge Nursing Home in Fleetwood. But in subsequent years, I did not know the identity of my biological father. It was kept from me till later on in life. During my school years, I first attended Blackiston Street Infant School in Fleetwood from the age of 5 until the age of 7. Upon leaving there, I went to Chaucer School at Fleetwood from the age of 7 until 11. Whilst at this school, I used to play for the Chaucer football team, and in the last year of my reign at school, I played right half in the school team and was very lucky to win the George Eliot Cup, for which I received a silver medal, which is in the shape of a football encased in yellow, and which I still have to this day. I also appeared in a school play at Chaucer Road as a soldier with one of the old bearskin hats. One of my uncles was kind enough to give me the school programme, which I have retained until this day as well. During my time at school, I played games like marbles in the grids and a cigarette game with fag cards, whereby you had to put the cards against the wall and then fire another cigarette card at them and knock them down. Whoever knocked all the cards down kept all the cigarette cards. Those were some of the games that I played when I was a child in Fleetwood. I had a happy childhood, and upon leaving Chaucer School I went to Big School, which was then Bailey Secondary High School in Fleetwood on Beach Road. I always walked to school from where I lived. I started off in Fairer Street as a young boy. When my mother later got married to my stepfather John, we moved to Blackiston Street. I would walk to Chaucer Road School and back for my dinners for the classes in the morning and upon the tea time run as well. When I went to the big school at the Secondary Modern, the same thing applied. I used to walk from Blackiston Street all the way to the Bailey School, which was a distance in excess of a mile, walk home at lunchtime, the same distance again, walk back after I had my lunch at home with my parents, and then walk back again at tea time. So I was walking 4 miles a day, and probably more, and it was keeping me very fit. I had a happy school life. I played for the school football team throughout my school years. I've went from centre forward to the right half position, which doesn't exist today. I was also the house captain of my house, Drake, for 2 years. It was signified by the colour red. At my school there were 4 houses: Raleigh, Drake, Grenville and Nelson. All had different colours, and you would compete against each other, not only in the swimming championships but also in athletics and in other sports as well. At school I was in the A stream. There's 2 streams run at school: a B stream for those that were regarded as not as intelligent, and then an A team for those that were regarded as being of a high academic suitability. I was the school champion swimmer from the age of 11, 12, 13, 14 and 15. Twice I was junior school champion, and 3 times I was senior school champion. I was also the school diving champion throughout school on the high board and on the lower boards as well. On one occasion, which I distinctly remember, my team was low in quality swimmers, so I asked the housemaster if in the freestyle race I could swim not only the first leg of the race but also the last leg of the race. And although we didn't actually win the race because of my speed and capacity to swim the freestyle, we actually came second out of the 4 teams. So that was one of my outstanding occasions in the swimming. In addition, I represented my school in the Fylde area, and I swam in the area finals at Blackburn in freestyle and represented my school area in the school swimming championships. Also, when I was at school, I took all of my life-saving qualifications, which I've still retained to this day, and I have all my certificates for breaststroke, freestyle stroke, backstroke, throughout my school years as swimming champion from probably about 1956 through to 1961/62. Some of the games that I used to play when I was a young boy are not played today by school children. When I was brought up at the Blackiston Street end, we used to play games like Dens Out. One of you would lean against a wall, count to maybe 20, and then everyone else would go and hide somewhere. The guy who was shouting the numbers out would then have to find them and catch them all. I also used to play in the street because we had plenty of chalk. We used to do a big hopscotch on the road because there wasn't a lot of cars then. I also used to play rounders, football in the street, and use the entrance to the back alleys as goals. I used to play football on the mounts. It was a happy time, and there was other games that I can't remember. Things that you wouldn't do today because of the advent of mobile phones and social media. However, it was something that I thoroughly enjoyed, and that's what being a child was in them days. Some of the things that I took up were blackberrying, something that kids would certainly not do today. I used to go over wire on the ferry. My mother would do a big shopping basket for me and douse it with newspaper at the bottom. We would go down all the hedgerows and gather 5 or 6 pound of blackberries, take them back to Mum's, and she would make a big blackberry pie, and we would have it with things like custard, ice cream or ordinary cream. Very delicious and very, very tasty. Another thing that I did as a child, and I'm not too proud of it, I used to go bird egging over the river. Something that's not done today and it's probably illegal, but we used to go around the hedgerows as kids and gather birds' eggs like missel thrushes, blackbirds, linnets. And a disgusting task would be to blow the egg, which means you would put a pin in the end of the egg and blow the egg out. Sometimes the young had formed and the young would come out of the egg. Sometimes it hadn't formed and it would come out like a normal chicken's egg. As I say, in those days it was a hobby, and I probably had a bird box with maybe 20 different sorts of eggs in. Illegal today though, and quite rightly so. I've got all my certificates in a suitcase downstairs which travelled everywhere with me on CID. I've got all my school certificates. I can remember being involved in the 100 yards on sports day. I can also remember being involved in the mile run, which would take place prior to sports day because it was a long race. And although I didn't win these races, I would like to think that I came in the first 3 or 4. I was also a school prefect for 2 years, and at the end of my school life, when I reached the 5th form, I actually took my O-levels, which were the grades that you took in my time, not like the GCSEs of today. The O-levels were run by 2 boards. One was the Joint Matriculation Board and the other was the AEB, the Associated Examining Board. When I completed my schooling, I took my exams and I got 4 O-levels. I didn't leave school in my 16th year. I stayed on in the 6th form and successfully managed to get another 3 O-levels, and I left school on my 17th birthday in April, whatever year that was. One other thing that I can remember doing when I was at school, I went on the beach with my parents at the tender age of 15 and a half, and some children had got into difficulties where the breakwater was at the old Fleetwood Pier. Some of the kids were rescued by people on the beach and pulled from the water, but one lad who was about 13 or 14 had got into the current. I think he was on possibly a small life ring, and he was carried out into the main channel with his parents and friends screaming and shouting for help. I ran down to the water's edge, and because I was a good swimmer, I dived in and I actually rescued him and brought him back to the shore and was thanked greatly by his mother and father. Subsequently, the local CID came down to see me and took a statement off me about the rescue, and a few months later I went with my headmaster, Mr. Donkersley, to the Mayor's Parlour in Fleetwood, where I was presented with a Liverpool Shipwreck and Humane Society plaque for the rescue of this boy. I've still got the plaque to this day. It's engraved in copperplate handwriting. It's at least size A4, and I've got it in a wooden frame and it's in parchment protected by a glass frame. I'm very proud of that. Fortunately, on the 27th of August this year, 2017, my cousin Michael found the old Fleetwood Chronicles dating back to September 1961, and in these chronicles is a record of me meeting the mayor at Fleetwood when I was only 15 and a half, and also a letter of the lads that I'd saved, parents thanking me and everyone else involved in the rescue, and a 3-paragraph story with my picture telling all about the rescue and the circumstances leading to it and the circumstances after it. Again, I'm very proud of that. What I intend to do with the newspapers which record the story, I'm going to have them photostated and blown up into A4 size and incorporated in a glass frame, which I shall give to my children as a memento of my heroism. When I left school, I then joined the civil service on the old premium bonds site at Lytham St Anne's, and I went into the stocks and bonds department. Because I'd got 7 O-levels, I escaped having to take the exam from the civil service. I finished up as a controller in charge of a section where I would dish out batches of work related to stocks and bond certificates and warrants, and these had to be checked and filed accordingly. This sort of work really was woman's work. It wasn't for me. So ultimately I left this occupation after 18 months or possibly 2 years. Several people came into the civil service who'd retired from work. One of them was an ex-Manchester City sergeant who had taken up this second occupation to supplement his police pension. He told me about the police and recommended it to me as a career. I took this man's advice, and at the age of 19 I joined Lancashire Constabulary on the 25th of October 1965. Throughout this time of my life, whilst I was a young man, I had quite a few girlfriends, but one that I fell in love with and married was my first wife, Barbara Griffin. I courted her at the premium bonds, that's where I got to know her. We went out for 18 months to 2 years. After joining the police, we were still courting. I got my first posting at a place called West Horton, which is on the outskirts of Bolton. They used to call it Cowhead Town because one day in a field, farmer had some cows and the cow got stuck in a set of wooden gates, and instead of cutting the gates off the cow's head, the farmer cut the cow's head off, so it got nicknamed Cowhead Town. Strange story, but allegedly true. It was a small market town, far smaller than Fleetwood. I'd only been there maybe 12 months when I asked Barbara to marry me. We got married in a church at Bispam, and because there was no police houses available at West Horton, I was transferred to the next town up, which was Little Hulton. This town was massive compared to West Horton. It consisted of 4 housing estates, and they were full of Salford Overspill people. I mean, a lot of them were born and bred Manchester people, Salfordites, but some of them were scumbags, to say the least. Because we got married so young, we got a free police house on the A6 near the Lucasade factory on Manchester Road West at Little Hulton. We moved in there, we had many happy times there, and that's where my first 2 children, to Barbara, were brought up. Jane, my eldest daughter, and Stephen, my eldest son. Again, we had happy times there, and that's where I learnt my trade as a down-to-earth policeman. In my time in the force, you dealt with every imaginable thing under the sun, ranging from things like dog bites, dangerous dogs, drunks, violent drunks, incapable drunks, minor criminal damage, shoplifters, although there weren't many shoplifters in the 60s, there weren't many stores that were eligible for shoplifters in the 60s, crime, theft, road accidents. I reported numerous road accidents, bike accidents, pedal cycle accidents, but this was a way of getting to know your local community, because when the weather was bad, particularly in winter time, you built up a series of brew shops. These were either persons' houses that you went to, or shops that you went to, even pubs that you went to. You got to know the local community, and they would give you sanction in bad weather and give you a brew, give you a cup of tea, and if you was lucky, maybe a sandwich or even a biscuit. And that's how you got to know the community in my time in the 60s. We were very close to the townsfolk. One of the things that we dealt with in young policemen at that time was sudden deaths. If someone died and a death certificate was not issued, then there had to be a post-mortem, and the first officer at the scene would record all the details, get in touch with the undertaker, get a doctor out to find the time of death. If he'd issued a death certificate, then there would not be a post-mortem. But a lot of times in those days, if you hadn't been seen by a doctor within a specified 14 days, the doctors would not issue a certificate. So it resulted in a post-mortem. So me as a young policeman at 19, right through to my mid-20s, attended dozens and dozens of post-mortems. You would have to accompany the body to the morgue and identify it to the pathologist and be present when he literally cut the body up. And the first thing he would do would place a knife at the corpse's throat and make an incision and cut the body all the way along the stomach right down to the navel, so his assistant could open the body up with pliers or pinchers or whatever to rip the skin open, break the rib cage and bring out all the vital organs, so as the pathologist could check them out and see if there was anything like, say, a condition like a heart attack, or if there was something to do with the lungs or any other associated diseases such as alcoholism or anything like that. Very interesting, but from an aroma point of view, the smell was absolutely disgusting. And as a point of interest, women, because of their reproductive organs, smelt 10 times worse than men. Some of the bobbies couldn't stand being at post-mortems and would move heaven and earth not to report sudden deaths. But I used to take the bull by the horns. I found them quite interesting. I've taken young policemen to post-mortems. One that I can remember distinctly was a lad called Kevin Hurst. His first post-mortem, we introduced ourselves to the pathologist. The body was on the slab, ready to be cut up. And as soon as the pathologist walked in and made for the first cut, Kevin fainted, collapsed and went straight through a glass cabinet containing forceps and all the equipment, all the tools that the pathologist used, and the cabinet was smashed to smithereens. I had to drag him outside and revive him by slapping his face and giving him a cigarette. Needless to say, Kevin, unfortunately, never went to another post-mortem. So, from a young man, some of these things were the making of me and give me the backbone to be the person I am today, and in that respect, I'm very thankful of it. So I'm at Little Hulton. 1967 Jane was born, beautiful baby. She was born at a hospital in Bolton. And then a few years after this, Barbara, my wife, came down pregnant with Stephen. However, another tragedy occurs now, because when she came down pregnant with Stephen, and prior to him being born, she was diagnosed with leukemia, which in those days was virtually untreatable, and it was touch and go whether she would live and the baby would die, whether they both would die or whether they both would live. They were completely unsure. However, it transpired that although he was born premature at 7.5 months, she did have a normal delivery, and because of her illness and because I got 2 young children, the Chief Constable of Lancashire sanctioned a compassionate move for me and my family to Fleetwood, where they gave me a police house. We came over to Fleetwood to live. I think it was in 1970 or 71. 12 months after she'd had Stephen, unfortunately Barbara died from leukemia and lymphatic cancer. Not only was the cancer in her blood, unfortunately it was in the bones as well. So she survived 12 months after giving birth to my son Stephen. I can remember the evening that she died, and I was only 26 then. I got a phone call off the hospital to go to Fleetwood Hospital, where she was in a ward on her own, and I went in to see her. We spoke a few words and held hands, and the last thing Barbara said to me was, Dave, they're attacking me, they're attacking me. She meaning that the cancer in her blood, the bad cells, were attacking her body, and shortly after that she died. So there was me at 26, police constable, back at Fleetwood, 2 young kids, Jane at 5 and Stephen at 1. So my mother, bless her soul, had taken me in and was quite happy to help me raise my 2 children, even though I was bereft of my wife. And for that, I'm eternally grateful, and I wish if I was put in that position with my children, I could do the same thing. Also, I'd like to say that my stepfather, Johnny Dunn, although he wasn't my real father, he did treat me as a son. He helped my mother bring my 2 children up, and again, I'm eternally grateful to him for that. Subsequently, I went downhill. I started drinking a lot because of the trauma that had happened to me with Barbara. I think I was lucky to actually stay in the service, because not so much at work, I wasn't drinking at work, but I would go on the lash as a young man, go nightclubbing, get involved, with women, particularly a lot of married women, which I'm not too happy about, but that was the sign of the times then. And I did play the field. I probably should have spent more time at home with my children, but you've got to remember, I still had to go to work, I still had to earn the money, I still had to give my mother money for my board, I still had bills to pay, I still had a car to run, and of course I did shift work. Not only did I do nights and afternoons and earlies, which involved getting up at 6 in the morning, going to work in the afternoon from 2 till 10. Then there was the night shift, which was 10 at night till 6. I had to do all these night shifts, and anyone who is a shift worker knows that it does grind you down eventually, and you do suffer from lack of sleep and stress and that sort of thing. Not that I'm complaining about stress, because stress doesn't really bother me. So I was back in shift work, I was back at home, I was back on the beat. Eventually I got the drinking bug out of my system and concentrated more on my work. I have to say that I was very, very good at arresting people. On nights sometimes I could, in a week, easily arrest 15 to 20 people, whereas some bobbies didn't have an appetite to it because it's quite confrontational, and when you're eyeballing someone and you have to arrest them and deprive them of their liberty, it's not something that some people want to do, but to me it was a job. It was a job I was getting paid for, and it was a job that I loved. So I did arrest an awful lot of people in Fleetwood. And likewise, when I was in Little Alton with the Salford overspill, I arrested many, many people over there. And of course, it pays dividends as well, because you go to court. I used to spend a lot of my time in the magistrates' court here at Fleetwood, both at the old courts in North Church Street and at the new courts on the seafront. I've had some real cracking days out at court. There was a lot of juvenile crime in Fleetwood. One of my court cases in particular, I can remember having done a secondment on the CID prior to me joining the CID full time. I started off with a young kid who admitted at least a couple of burglaries down the old Sidings Road in Fleetwood, Hodgkinson's Pop Yard and one or two other places. Eventually, it was like a novel, he'd done over 20 burglaries. And then he involved a load of other kids. And eventually when I did the court file and it went to court, not only did I take over the whole of the juvenile court, I took over the whole of the magistrates court with a woman police sergeant who was prosecuting, called Irene Grimshaw, and the court was full. There must have been between 20 and 30 kids there, all aged from 10 up to 16, and mums and dads were there as well. The court was full. Newspaper reporters were there from the local Gazette and Chronicle, and the case went on for about 2 hours. I think the court was gobsmacked, and it was my hard work that had resulted in all these arrests and clearing up dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of burglaries. Another highlight of my life. I thoroughly enjoyed that case. Then, when I got my life back to normal, I started courting a local girl called Diana in the mid-70s. I went out with her for about 3 years, and ultimately we got married in 1976, I think. She had to put up with the traumas of the police, all the shifts I was on. Another outstanding incident I can remember is when the floods came to Fleetwood, I think it was in 1978. I'd started my tour of duty, I was on 2 till 10 and I was the van driver. During the course of the evening, it was a very high tide, 33 foot. There was strong prevailing northwesterly winds, which went to gale force, and because it was an oncoming wind, it actually put 7 foot on the height of the tide. And the tide that came in must have been 40 foot. The whole of the town flooded. All of the top end of the town, that's the whole of Larkhall, was flooded. And I can remember coming down Rossall Lane, coming to the traffic lights that meets Broadway, and it was like a convergence of rivers. In the transit van that I was in, a Ford Transit van, the water actually came up the side and was actually coming into the van, so it must have been easily over 3 foot deep. We were rescuing people, getting them out of the houses, going round and ensuring that people were safe. I was using the tannoy to tell people that the town was flooded. And then I suddenly had a brainstorm thinking, good God, my family, which consisted of Diana, Stephen and James. Philip was at home, and I think Richard was as well. I suddenly remembered I better go and see if my own family's okay. So when I eventually got home to my house at maybe 10:30, 11 o'clock, Di and the kids were upstairs on the bedroom floor. The sea had come in and the house was under 3 foot of water. So I'm glad I remembered to go and see them. It was just that I was so engrossed in the floods and saving people out on the streets. I didn't finish my tour of duty until 6 o'clock in the morning, thoroughly knackered, but I'd enjoyed being involved in the floods and saving part of the town. After I'd got married to Diane, we had 3 children, Philip, Richard, and the last, but by no means least, was Laura, the youngest. So I had some happy times bringing the children up. But it's like anything else, the man, he has to go to work, the man has to earn the money, someone has to pay the bills, and of course it falls upon the woman to bring the children up, which is the same in every home. And maybe I didn't spend as much time at home with my kids as I wished I could, but that was the times for all families in them days. You had to get the money to pay to live. So I was earning good money. I used to get a lot of overtime because I was a grafter and I worked just as hard, if not harder, than anyone else in Fleetwood Police Station. Jimmy Porter, who was the admin sergeant who dished out the overtime, used to give me more than my fair share. But having said that, I did work my bollocks off, so I'm quite thankful to him for that. I finished up being approached to do CID training at Fleetwood, which consisted of 6 months working with the detectives, and I joined them. I enjoyed the training. And again, because I liked arresting people, I got thoroughly involved with it, because at the end of the day, everybody wants to be a detective. Everyone wants to solve the mystery. I was locking up people left, right and centre. I was getting paid for it. I loved it, and it was a way of life to me. So I was thankful for that. So my kids, the first house we had when I married Barbara and when we came back to Fleetwood, we lived down Ribble Road in Fleetwood. That's where Stephen and Jane were originally brought up, and that was a police house, so we didn't have to pay for it. Even though she was ill, the police was kind enough to give me another house on Broadway, which was even bigger, a semi-detached, a nice location. But unfortunately, she died in 1971. So as I've said, I went back living with my parents on Fleetwood Road, stayed there for maybe 3 or 4 years, got married to Di, and then the first house that we had was a police house in Highbury Avenue, where we used to have parties. Those were happy times as well. In the summer of 1976, I dug the whole of the back garden over, which was just plain grass with a few trees, and planted dozens, if not hundreds, of potato plants. We were eating potatoes for the next 12 months. This summer was very, very hot. I'm talking about in the 80s. To look after my family, I'd done my CID training. I'd thoroughly enjoyed it. Even though I'd got 11 years service in, which was a decent amount of service, I'd never ever taken my police exams. To get promoted to sergeant, you had to pass your sergeant's exam, and likewise to get promoted to inspector, you had to pass your inspector's exam. It was pointed out to me by some of the older sergeants, if you want to shake hands with door handles the rest of your life, Dave, don't bother taking your bleeding exams. But if you want to look after your family, you're intelligent enough, take the bloody exams. I've been away from training school for so long, you couldn't go back to it at my age then. But during this summer, I enrolled in a correspondence course, which I had to pay for, and I think it cost me 80 quid if I remember rightly. This was a hellishly hot summer, and I would lie outside on a lilo, doing the correspondence course, answering the questions. I would get me answers back, and at the end of the year, I think in 77, I took the sergeant's exam, and fortunately I passed it. I passed the sergeant's exam, so I was proud of that. And then one of the sergeants again said, now that you're clued up with knowledge, it'd be such a waste for you not to take your inspector's exam because you've just studied and you're awash with knowledge. Get the bloody thing taken. So the next year I enrolled for another correspondence course and studied, took the exam in the November. You had to get a minimum of 50%. It's not like in today's exams where it's tick boxes and that sort of thing. It's all the old stuff where you have to write essays. Unfortunately for me, I passed the crime paper, I passed the general police knowledge paper, and I dipped my traffic exam by only 2 marks. But in those days, if you failed one of the papers by 5 marks or less, you was into a referral system and you could actually take the paper you'd failed again. So I grasped it with both hands, studied like hell for bloody 6 months, took the inspector's exam again, and I passed the traffic exam by 70 marks. I got 70%. I smashed it. Armed with that and my family's interests, I'd not only got the sergeant's, I'd also got the inspector's exam as well. After I passed the exam, an approach was made by the CID and I went on probation on the CID for 6 months. I did very, very well at it. One of the cases that I was involved in, I actually had an informant who gave me some information about a man who burgled a house in Fleetwood, and he actually had a gun with him. It was two Preston criminals. We got them arrested and the arrest went down to me. It was interesting in so much as you don't really get many cases. Certainly not in my time in the 60s where someone's been arrested for being in charge of a gun. So that was another case that I thoroughly enjoyed. I successfully completed my CID training and an approach was made to me by the local CID bosses to actually apply for the CID. They wanted me to become part of the detective team. So I went over to see Di and told her. She wasn't too happy because she knew that CID work was long and hard, and although the money was better than the uniform, she was aware that they also kept late hours, and she really didn't want me to go on the CID. She fought hard and long for me not to go on, but it was my career and my decision, and I went on. At that time, she actually worked in a local bookies. I think it was either Ladbrokes or William Hills on Polton Road. And I actually went in there to give her my decision without discussing it with her, and she wasn't a pleased lady, but I think she realised it was a way of life for me and something I wanted to do, so she did not stand in my way. So I go on CID. I do 2 years on the CID at Fleetwood. I get involved in a load more arrests again. I work very, very hard, and I like to think and my bosses in then times respected my workload and ultimately they wanted me to do well. So I finished up going on detective courses. The first one was at Liverpool, where at the end of 2 years on CID you did your initial detective course. It was a 6-week course and you took exams at the end of it. You mixed with detectives from all over Ireland, Scotland, Wales, Manchester, Liverpool. Every force sent detectives to it, so there was a wide spectrum of different people, and at the end of it you took a criminal law exam, and out of 2 classes there was 40 in each. Because I was good at exams, out of the 2 classes I came second. I had the second highest marks out of all of them, and the report went back to my bosses saying that I'd done very, very well on the academic side of the course. So I was pleased with that. I worked hard for it. After doing my 2 years stint, I did get promoted Detective Sergeant in 1982, and I was seconded to the #1 Regional Crime Squad at Blackpool, where I spent 3 years in that department. I teamed up with detectives from all over Lancashire, and my designated area was Preston and the Blackpool area. Completely different line of work to being a provincial detective, where you were dealing with bread and butter things like burglars, thieves. Whereas on the crime squad you tried to get a higher grade of criminal, and we would be involved in surveillances, which were very interesting. And to do a surveillance properly, it's not like you see on television today where one car follows another. To do a proper surveillance you would need a motorbike, who would be the lead vehicle. Then you would have 3 squad cars. Squad cars would be double manned, the motorbike would be single crewed, and then you'd also have foot soldiers. So in effect, you had a motorbike man, you had 3 drivers of the cars, and they would each be accompanied by a footman. So you actually had 7 people doing a surveillance on either one vehicle or on one person. It was labour intensive. If the villain that you was following in would see one of the cars or suspect that one of them was following him, you would swap positions. One would move up and one come down, and you would alternate accordingly. A specialised type of work and very interesting. One of the outstanding things I can remember on my time on the crime squad, there was an Irish terrorist, I think he was called Barry McGee. He actually blew up one of the hotels, I think it was in Bournemouth, and killed several either MPs or MPs' families. He'd done this by planting bombs in the hotel rooms. He actually came up to Lancashire. The police at Lancashire received information that he was going to blow up the soldiers at Wheaton Camp. We started following him round in Blackpool, where he met an informant. The informant was close to the police and would tell us about the meetings. One particular meeting that I was involved in was on the seafront at Blackpool, when McGee was accompanied by a man who would following him at a close distance of maybe 100 yards. He was like his protector, his minder. And unbeknown to us at the time we were following him, the protector had a handgun in his pocket to protect McGee in case he was approached by anybody. Me and a female colleague, a woman detective, actually went into the Metropole to watch a meeting with McGee and this informant, and we were sat at tables no more than maybe 30 feet from where McGee was, and his minder was in the same room. Ultimately they decided, for whatever reasons, not to blow up the camp at Wheaton, and eventually went back over the water. But as I said, he did return to England and he blew up the hotel where some MPs and their wives were murdered by bombs by the IRA. So that was quite a dangerous mission that we were on, and we didn't find out about his minder carrying these guns until after we'd been stood down. So upon completing my time on the crime squad in 1984-85, I returned to Fleetwood and was returned to Detective Sergeant, covering Fleetwood, Cleveland, Thornton and Poulton, back to the basic menu of dealing with day-to-day crime and arrests. Again, I thoroughly enjoyed my time doing that. Then, as you get older, you realise that you've got to take the promotion to get a better pension. So in 1990, after being on CID for 16 years, I went on a promotion board and I was promoted to Uniform Inspector and went to Blackpool Central Police Station on the 1st of January 1990. I served there until 1994-95. Back on the dreaded shift work again, back on nights, back on earlies, whereas on CID your workload was from 9 in the morning till when you finished, maybe 9 or midnight. So I was in charge of a lot more men than when I was on CID. But a superintendent said to me, when you're on nights, Dave, at Blackpool, you have to cover 3 police stations, which was Blackpool Central, Blackpool South and Blackpool North. So I would have getting on for maybe 100 men under my command as the sole inspector on duty, 3 police stations and all the resources, all the police cars and everything else that went with it. He pointed out to me that it was like running a multi-million-pound agency because of the amount of equipment and manpower available to me. But I was there on my own in charge, so some people would think that was quite daunting, but it's like anything else. You've just got to get your head around it, accept it, because you're the boss, you're in charge, and the buck stops with the boss. Again, quite demanding, very, very interesting. One of the things that I became well known for and respected for at Blackpool was taking identification parades. A lot of the inspectors body swerved because you had to get a certain amount of men to run the parade, then you had to contact all the witnesses, then you had to bring them into the police station. There had to be no contact between any of the villains and any of the witnesses. It took a long time to set them up, and then the inspector himself had to run the parades, speak to the witnesses, show them the lineups and try and get identifications. It was a long time consuming business, and some of my colleagues of my rank frowned from doing the job. And I can well remember it in my time at Blackpool as a uniform inspector. I conducted in excess of 100 identification parades. Again, it's something I'm very proud of. And on one summer's evening, when a team of Liverpool Scousers descended on Blackpool and ran amok in the stores, they were arrested, and subsequently I ran the identification parades for these Scouse villains. And me and my sergeant, Norman Ellsby, had to sort all the parades out, and on one particular summer's night, in one night between 8 AM and 11:30, we ran nearly 26 identification parades. A huge amount of parades to run. It's hard enough trying to run one, but when you've got that amount, it is unbelievable. I've also been involved in at Blackpool. In my time, gun incidents used to be 10 a penny, and usually the Bobby on the beat dealt with them. But in the late 80s and the 90s, each division had an ARV crew, which means an armed response vehicle. And what it meant was there were 2 Bobbies in a police vehicle, and in the boot of the car there were guns and ammunition in case there was firearms incidents, because they were coming more and more to the fore. In my time, it wasn't as labour intensive as it is in those days, as I've just outlined. The gun car could be called upon anywhere in the division to deal with a firearm incident. A lot of them, fair enough, were minor. It was either fake guns, imitation replica guns, or maybe an air rifle or an air pistol. But now and again it did turn out to be the real thing, so you had to be wary of this all the time, and each case had to be sort of identified on its merits. So at that time, whoever the inspector was on in duty had to look after the ARV, and of course on nights there was no one else other than the inspector. That's the system as it was in them days. I enjoyed being in some of the armed incidents. I have been involved in quite a few. The Life of Christy, Part 2. When I was a young boy of about 10 or 11, my mother, who was a very good swimmer, taught me how to swim in the swimming baths in the old Fleetwood open air swimming pool. To enable me to swim and to swim quickly, she took me into the shallow end of the swimming pool, which was huge. It was 88 yards long by 33 yards across. Absolutely huge. So she taught me to swim in the shallow end, and one of her techniques was she bought me a pair of bright pink flippers, which she put on the extremities of both hands and taught me how to scoop the water out, taught me how to swim by means of the breaststroke and the crawl. My better stroke turned out to be the freestyle front crawl, which is far faster stroke. But I thank my mother for teaching me how to swim. Another thing that stands out in my memory from them times is, thinking about 90 and 91, the prison officers went on strike and the prisons were over-zapped out, they were overstrength with prisoners, and they refused to take the overspill because of the lack in the manning levels. So what happened was, a large amount of the police forces in the country became what they call holding cells for prisoners. In my time at Blackpool, they would turn over an extra maybe 15 to 20 cells for the taking of the inmates from the prisons, and the whole operation was called Operation Container. This was to contain a surplus of the prisoners which should have gone in prison but ultimately came to the police stations. And at Blackpool Central there was a large complex of cells and inspectors were put in charge of the containers. Every person who worked on the containers, be it a police constable or a police sergeant or indeed an inspector, could only work on their days off. They could not work on a normal day. So the bonus was that not only did you get extra money on your day off, you also got double time. So there was a huge amount of money to be earned by everyone on the container. Now, a lot of the inspectors at Blackpool, for whatever reasons, they did not like being in the cells, mixing with all the strange, horrible riff-raff villains, thieves and rogues, people who should have been incarcerated in the prison. So a lot of the inspectors declined to do the containers, which benefited David Michael Christy in the extreme, because at the end of the container, after something like 12 to 18 months, I finished up doing in excess of 120 container duties, which earned me an awful lot of money, and as a result of it I bought a brand new 2 litre Vauxhall Carlton in satanic grey, which my wife and I used to enjoy running around in, and that was our signature from all the hard work that I'd done on the containers. I'd like to thank all the other inspectors who didn't do the duties on the containers, because the Christie family benefited with a brand new car. Thank you very much. Time at Blackpool was varied, was interesting. I did deal with quite a few bomb scares, quite a few firearms incidents. One which does spring to mind was in the Howlands Hill Centre at Blackpool, and there was a suitcase which had been left abandoned in the town centre. We had to turn out the army unit to defuse the packets, because if there was any likelihood that a bomb had been placed, the bomb squad would turn out with their men and they would blow the package up. I can well remember this incident. It was a Saturday afternoon, the town centre was packed, a suitcase had been found outside one of the shops. We had to evacuate the whole area, let the bomb squad in, and this mobile unit, which was on wheels, whilst it went down the aisle in the centre to blow up the package, it did detonate it. But unfortunately there was such a sharp recoil on the unit that this mobile army bomb disposal thing, it was like a robot, and such was the explosion, it forced this little robot back on its metal wheels, and it went through a huge side plate glass window of another one of the shops. I did not tell the full story to the owners of the property, I just put it down to the explosion, although it was somewhat a reckless act by the army unit. After completing maybe 5 years on the streets of Blackpool, I decided it was time for a move, so I returned to my hometown of Fleetwood in about 95 and served my final 2 years in the force there. And I got back to Fleetwood. There was only a few inspectors left there. The command ranks had all been stripped. I think there was just a super there, a chief inspector and 5 inspectors. And in my final year, Fleetwood actually left the old Blackpool division and it went in with Lancaster, and at that time they stripped all the ranks again, and I finished up as the only inspector left at Fleetwood in charge. So I decided during that last year that the job had changed. Something like staff appraisals, I had to write in a year dozens if not hundreds of staff appraisals, which were quite repetitive, and I didn't really enthuse a lot about doing them. So I made a conscious decision in, I think it was 1996, I would retire after having completed 32 years in Lancashire Constabulary. And I like to think I committed myself to the police service, and I worked very, very hard, and I got well paid at it, and I got a cracking pension out of it. So I can only thank the police force for a thoroughly interesting and varied career, one which I certainly wouldn't have had in my original first job, the civil service, a boring 9-to-5 thing. I went with a friend of mine up to the Isle of Skye on a fishing trip where we caught a load of different species, including haddock up to £6, thornback ray up to £12, and pollock up to £8, and a multitude of other different species. The policeman friend that I was with, Peter Gray, said to me, "Oh, what the bloody hell are you going to do, Dave?" You know, I said, "Well, I'm going to fish." I said, "I'll dinghy fish, and I'll pier fish, and I'll fish on the charter boats, and I'll fish off the shore." And my friend turned around to me and said, "You're going to get bored out of your bloody skull." He said, "Can't you dig bait?" I said, "Well, yeah, I can dig bait. I've always been able to dig bait with a fork." And he said, "Well, why don't you start selling the blackworms, which are a worm that are about 8 to 12 inches long, a prime bait used for catching sea fish." So I said, "Well, I'm going to have to get someone to teach me how to dig the damn things." And he said, "Well, you're in the boat club." He said, "Your crew for me is my crew." He said, "I'll introduce you to someone who actually digs bait." So he introduced me to a fellow club member. After I retired, which was in September 1996, I took some lessons off this guy, and he would take me on the beach at Cleveland's, and he would teach me how to use not a fork, not a spade, but a pump, because in the late 80s and the early 90s, instead of digging these worms with forks and spades, there had come into being a pump called an Alvey pump, which was 30 inches to 36 inches long. It was made of stainless steel, and it had a bore on it. By that I mean the width of the funnel at the end of the tube, because it was a metal tube, was about 3 to 4 inches across. It was very, very wide like that. But the Englishmen, over a period of years, they adapted it to a narrow bore like that, ultimately 1 inch across. So anyway, this lad in the fishing club, he taught me in February how to use the pump. I started off digging a few tails and a few halves of worm and then full worm, and over the summer period of that year I could go down and went from getting 50 up to getting 300 worms. So I was digging them for myself, members of my family, and ultimately members in the beach club and the boat club, and I was actually selling them and making myself a bit of dosh. So as I got better and better, I found out that I was digging that many, I had to resort to freezing them down. So I finished up buying freezers and putting them in my shed. I now have 6 freezers. Most of them at some stage towards the end of the year would be full of worms which had frozen down. So I had to find an outlet, because I was digging so many worms, to sell them. So I went to the library. This is in 1996, before social media had gained a rapid pace like it is now in the 2000s. So went through the yellow pages, got telephone numbers off shops. I think I may even have ripped a few pages out of the yellow pages, but for God's sake, don't go to the library and tell them I've done that. This was bloody years ago. I used to ring round the shops, and over a period of probably 5 or 6 years, I built up a sales network, and I started sending by means of courier to shops in Ireland, Scotland, Wales, the Isle of Guernsey, and numerous shops on the northeast and the southern coast and the western coast as well. And in its heyday, when I was young, when I say young, in my 50s, early 60s, I probably had a shop network of about 34 shops. In addition to that, I also had people who would call class as door trade, who came and bought worms on a regular basis each week from my home, from the block of holiday flats at Hosborne House, which fortunately was situated on the seafront at Fleetwood. In the first 10 years of this mini empire, when I was making quite a lot of money, it got to the stage where it was better than my police pension, which is rather a decent pension. And Di, my wife, became somewhat concerned about not declaring this to HRM Revenue, the tax people for you, because she ran a business with the holiday flats. She wanted me to declare this source of income. So after 10 years of avoidance of tax, I then took the honest approach, and through my accountant I went legitimate, and for the last 10 years since I've been doing it, unfortunately I've had to pay quite a bit of tax. The business is still going to this day, even as I am speaking to you now in August 2017. I'm still digging bait and I'm still selling bait all over the country. I had business cards printed. I was classed as a bait retailer, and in addition to the worms, anglers would come and ask me for things like weights and traces, rods and reels, fish baits, crab baits, mussel baits. So I had to go with the flow, and to accommodate their desires, I finished up selling all the things that I've previously outlined. So my revenue streams increased as well. I used to do trade-offs with the shops and barter worms and get different things like rods and reels and fish baits, etc, etc. So it's been a very interesting life in the second part of my career, because when I started off worming, you've got to remember I was an ex-policeman, or as some of the people used to call me, that bastard copper, the ex-copper. And I used to get call names on the beach because a lot of the people that are digging this bait, they're all on the king coal, or they're all alcoholics, or they're all gamblers, or they've been criminals. They're not the sort of normal, upstanding, decent member of societies. Although they're good cracker lads, they come from varied backgrounds, and they used to take exception to somebody like me, especially an ex-policeman stroke ex-copper, coming into their environment, because they were always fearful that I'd still got contacts in the police, that I could report them. I could report them to the social, I could report them to the Inland Revenue, and they didn't take too high a regard to me emerging on the scene as a professional black bait digger and supplier of black worms. Some of the things, some of the tales I encountered, the lad who showed me how to dig in Cornwall from Cleveland's, he was quite entrepreneurial himself, because he was nowhere near as fit as me. I was a fit, strong man in my early 50s. I could walk miles. And these worm beds at Knott End, at Fleetwood, at Cleveland's, at Blackpool, at St Anne's, at Lytham and at Southport, because I used to go, I get a van and go digging in all these places. The worm beds are at the extremities of the water, and they only become exposed at low water when the tide receded and gone a long way out. And you had to walk sometimes up to 2 miles there, dig maybe for 2 or 3 hours, and then do a 2-mile walk back carrying a bucket full of worms. So it kept me very fit, and I did dig in a lot of places on the northwest coast. Ian, like I say, he was entrepreneurial. We clubbed together and we bought an old BSA 500cc motorcycle for about 100 quid. And Ian was quite knowledgeable about bikes. He'd service it, and he adapted it for the equipment that we used to use. We each had a stainless steel pump that was 3 foot long. We each had baskets with holes in to put the worms in and wash them off, because when you kill these worms, you really murdered them. You used to either smash them on the head, hit them against the pump, all the blood and all the guts would come out of the worms. Your hands would be coated in brown, yellow blood, which stained your hands forever and a day. Ian devised baskets at the front of the bike to contain our 2 worm buckets, but he also designed 2 plastic tubes at the back of this BSA bike that pointed upwards, and they were like rocket chambers in which you could put the pump in each of these 2 chambers by means of a form of carrying them at the back of the pump. They were encased in these plastic tubes, a bit like Wacky Races, because it did look like 2 rockets coming out of the back of the bike. And he used to wear an old aircraft hat with flaps, so when we was going along it was very much like the bike on the Wacky Races that you used to see on BBC television. But it enabled us to cover a lot of ground, find the location of the worm beds far more quickly, and get off the beach far more quickly if the weather was inclement. This contraption, this motorbike that he designed, used to upset some of the local diggers, and I can remember one occasion in the late 90s and the early 2000s when 2 of the Fleetwood diggers who were unemployed and were, for the want of a better word, were rough and ready. We were out digging and parked the bike up, and these 2 Fleetwood lads who were a lot younger than us. They were in the 30s and we were in our mid-50s. And one of them came running up, knocked our motorbike off its stand and shouted and swore at us and virtually told us to F off and get off the beach, off the patch. Ian, being very small, didn't want any shouting match and certainly didn't want any fighting, but I was a lot bigger than him and a lot taller, and I ran after this younger man and I threatened to chop his head off with my pump and told him in no uncertain terms it was a free beach, and if anyone should clear off the beach it should be him and his bloody mates. We came to a compromise and we decided to actually dig in 2 different areas, which I wasn't happy with, but I conceded Ian's fears and we came off without being injured. That certainly stands out in my memory. So I continued with the worm digging, with supplying the shops, and like I say, it was a really good income. It kept me really fit. It paid for a lot of holidays. It paid for my wife to have a new car every maybe 3 or 4 years. We had holidays in America and abroad. It was quite a lucrative living. I'm still doing that today, like I've said, but later on in life I succumbed to illness. I was as fit as a fiddle until the age of 70, which was in 2016, and in March of that year, on the 21st of March, I went digging with my son Philip to the North Pier at Blackpool, and I'd only been down on the beach maybe an hour, and suddenly I felt a sharp stabbing pain in my lower stomach. I felt as though my stomach was coming out of my body, and I collapsed on the beach in agony. It took me an hour to slowly walk off the beach back to where I'd parked my van. My son did accompany me, and eventually he took me to Blackpool Victoria Hospital, and after 4 hours I was duly seen by the doctor on duty. I underwent several tests, blood, urine, x-rays, which revealed absolutely nothing other than, he said, you've probably ripped a few pectoral muscles in your chest. I'm going to give you some painkillers, ibuprofen. Should the pain persist, come back and see us. Well, for the next 6 weeks, apart from a minor pain in my tummy, I had no side effects, no sickness, no nausea. I even went to my 70th birthday party in the Trafalgar restaurant with several family and friends, and although I was a little bit under the weather, I enjoyed the evening and still had a 3-course meal and plenty of scoops, including whiskey and beer. But like I say, for 6 weeks there was nothing wrong with me at all. So eventually I went to see my own doctor, and she did all the tests again without me being too repetitive, the bloods, the urine, x-rays, MRI scans, and absolutely nothing. She thought that I'd possibly got an abscess. I did have a bit of a fever, a bit of a hot temperature, and she said there's obviously something there that's wrong in your body, but I cannot find out what it is. So I'm going to send you for a CT scan to Blackpool Victoria. So towards the end of April, I went to the Vic, I had the CT scan, and Dr. Khaled, the doctor in charge of me at that time, said, "Oh, you look alright to me, Mr. Christy. When I get the results, I'll ring you up and have you in." Well, 2 days later he rang me and basically said, "I want you to get your arse in here now. I want you to go and see Dr. Blackmore. It's far more serious than what we thought." So I went to the Vic, where I saw Dr. Blackmore. He sat me down and said, "Do you want me to give it you nice and softly, or do you want the full picture straight away?" I said, "Well, look, doctor, I've been in the police 30 years, just wang me in the face with it." I said, "Because don't beat about a bush, I want to know straight away." He said, "Well, unfortunately for you, David, you've got a busted intestine, you have a ruptured appendix, and inside your bowel you have a tumour the size of a clenched fist." I was absolutely gobsmacked. I knew that I'd injured myself. I knew that the pump had done the injuries to me, but never in a million years did I think I'd sustained all those injuries. And he said to me, "You're staying in hospital overnight, we're operating first thing in the morning." And that's what happened. The next day I was sedated, operated on, and the tumour was removed, and the appendix were removed, and the intestines were duly repaired and mended. I was in intensive care for only 3 days, and as it is with hospitals today, they do need the beds, and so eventually I was shipped out home, where I was cared for by my wife, Di. Whilst I was in hospital, it came really home to me of a great fashion that there was something possibly amiss, because two of the doctors that had actually been on the operating team came to see me, and when I asked them why, they turned around and said, well, really David, you shouldn't be here because of all the injuries that you caused to yourself, and because of the tumour, and because you tolerated that for 6 weeks, and also the possibility, in addition to all that poisonous stuff in your body, and the strong possibility that you would have had septicemia, you was a dead man walking basically. You should have not have survived those 6 weeks, and you probably should not have survived the operation as well. However, they'd both come to see me with a pleasant smile on their face, just basically to make sure that I was still here and I was still alive. Before I actually left, Dr. Blackmore, the surgeon, he came to see me and said, when you go home, David, you're going to get hit by the freight train. And I said to him, what the bloody hell is the freight train? And he said, you're going to get hit by depression. I said, well, I've been as fit as a butcher's dog till you operated on me. I said, I've never had depression in my life. He said, well, you just wait and see. The first week at home proved to be my downfall, and proved to be that he was telling me the truth, because I had a week where I had nightmares, I could not get to sleep, my brain was like a car engine, more like a washing machine, a tumble dryer. It would not switch off, it kept revolving and turning around all the time. I became more and more tired and weaker, and I had all strange thoughts about taking my own life, about committing suicide, about walking out of the house at 2 o'clock in the morning and walking into the river. Not nice. And I do realise now when people are ill with mental illnesses, like my son Richard, and people that suffer from all sorts of mental illnesses like depression and other associated illnesses, I have been there and can empathise with them about their illnesses. That was the first week, the nightmares. The second week was just as bad, because I started having panic attacks. My heart was beating like a thunderstorm, chest moving up and down rapidly, couldn't stay calm, fidgeting all the time, had to lie down, and again I had odd thoughts, and I was planning my funeral, writing my own eulogy, and one day in particular stands out. It was tea time, the panic attack came on, I came into my middle lounge to lie down. My eldest son Philip was quite concerned and said, you know, you're not so well, Dad, I'm going to ring the ambulance. And he did ring the ambulance, and within 20 minutes they turned out, alarm sirens going, and they landed outside on my front door, and he shouted to me, the ambulance is here now, Dad. I said, look, I'm not going to hospital. I've still got it, but it's not as bad. I'm not being shipped out to hospital because I don't want to go down there, I don't want to leave the home. So he did see the ambulance crew and told them that the situation had changed somewhat, and that I was in a better frame of mind, in a better condition, so I was not whisked off to hospital, thank God. At the end of this second week, something had to be done, so I went to see my own doctors and made a request for sleeping pills. They totally and utterly denied sanctioning the use of them because of what I'd been through with the operation. So I asked them if I could self-medicate, and they said, what the hell are you talking about? So I said, is it alright if I give myself a couple of beers and maybe a glass of scotch to help me bloody sleep? I said, I can't go on like this. And they did have a bit of a laugh about it and said, well, so long as you only do it in moderation, it's fine. And that night, that's exactly what I did. I had 2 lagers, I had a glass of scotch, and from that day on until now, I have never had any nightmares, I have never had any panic attacks, I've never had any palpitations. The whole scene, fortunately, has been put behind me, and I'm still in a good state of health now. After the operation, when they removed the tumour, they also took some lymph nodes or blood cells from in my lower body, and unfortunately for me, it revealed that out of 8 cells they'd taken, 3 were infected with the cancer. So it was then that I was placed on 6 months of chemo, which started at the end of June and went through right to almost to Christmas, when I had 2 lots of intensive chemo every month, and I underwent, I think it was 12 courses of chemo. The only side effect that I suffered was tiredness, because it's quite a poisonous drug, and I was quite weak. And one of the things which I should really go into the Guinness Book of Records for was diarrhoea. In the first few months I was on the toilet more than I care to think about, and I think one day in particular I went 23 times to the toilet between the hours of 11 AM and 11 PM. Something I'm not particularly proud of, and the backside was certainly very sore. Those were the two main side effects for me. I appreciate that lots of other people have far more serious side effects, and some people can't even stand taking the chemo. And if you don't take the chemo, then rest assured you're going to be in your box sooner than what you think. After the chemo, I had a thoroughly nice Christmas with my family, my children, which I celebrated and enjoyed. One of the things the chemo did, I mean, I'm actually a beer drinker. I'm class myself as a professional beer drinker, and during the first 4 months of my illness, I could taste the beer and it wasn't a problem. But when it got to September, the year that I was taking the chemo, another side effect appeared, and it turned out that it attacked the extremities of your body, including my fingers on both hands, which became numb and tingly, and also the lower part of my legs, the muscles and my feet. It was like frozen blocks of ice. It also went to the extremities of my nose, which on occasions would bleed slightly, and it also went to the extremities of my tooth. It actually stopped my gums from bleeding, which I've suffered with for years. That was a plus side for me. But apart from those side effects, the one that I sustained, which I didn't like, was the loss of tasting liquid, particularly beer. So I actually stopped. I stopped after nearly 40 years partaking of alcohol because I couldn't taste the damn stuff. Fortunately, after I'd finished the chemo at Christmas, it did come back, so I was able to manage a few beers then. Come February 2017, I had my bloods taken, they were clear. Come April 2017, I went for a wonderful thing called a colonoscopy, which is where they put a camera up your bottom. One of the better experiences of my life at the hospital. That came back totally clear. And then, at the end of May, I completed my treatment with a CT scan. Unfortunately for me, after a fortnight, it revealed that I'd got a lesion on my lung, and it resulted in me being sent for a PET scan to Shorrow Green Hospital at Preston. A PET scan is far more intensive than a CT scan. It actually goes inside all the internal organs and slices them up and actually defines exactly what is inside each organ and the strength of it, whether it's benign and how aggressive it is. And the results of that came out a fortnight after my PET scan, and I went to see Dr. Blackamore on the 7th of July 2017, the surgeon who'd operated on me at the Vic. And unfortunately for me, the cancer cells had escaped into my system. They travelled either through the blood vessels or they travelled through the lymph nodes, and one was found, a lesion which was a secondary cancer, was found on my lung. Another lesion, another secondary cancer, was found in my liver, and 2 more lesions were found in my stomach. So the doctor said to me, "I'm sorry to say, David, but we can only offer you palliative care. We can't do too much for you at the moment. You're going to have to see Dr. Lau, who may put you on some palliative treatment." I was quite shocked. I was shocked when I was told last year that I had the cancer. I was very shocked last year, but my head had got round it and I'd accepted it, and I knew that the damn thing was going to come back. I knew that it wouldn't be beaten. What did surprise me was the intensity of it, because I thought it's going to come back. It might come back in the same place, it might locate itself on another organ, but to be told that it was in 3 internal organs was a hell of a blow, and I was very shocked about that. But I have since got my head around it. I have accepted it and I am managing it, and I'm quite positive about it, and I'll try my best to beat the damn thing, but the odds are stacked against me. So I actually said to him, I said, "Doctor," I said, "with one life you operate on me and you save my life." I said, "and then with the other hand," I said, "you actually give me a death sentence and tell me that I've only got 18 months, maybe 2 years to live." I said to him, "The very least you could have done, doctor, was to have worn a wig when I came in your surgery this morning." He didn't know which way to take me at first, but he realised that my mechanism of dealing with the illness was my warped sense of humour. I've still got it now that I'm talking, and it'll go down to me with the grave. It's after all the exciting times being in the police and the hard things that I've come across in the police, and losing my wife aged 24 to the dreaded leukemia, a mixture of different sorts of scenarios that I've come across in the police. But at the end of the day, I'm thankful that I'm the way I am, and I'm thankful that all the past is helping me deal with this illness. And if my warped sense of humour has offended any of you, I can't say that I'm going to apologise to you, because that's the way David Christy is, and it's the way I've been all my life. Thank you. I'm truly thankful to my wife Di for looking after me during my illness in the last 18 months, but most importantly, without her help I wouldn't have a worm business. I've still got a worm business today, I'm still running it today, and one of the things that stands out in my mind is whilst in hospital suffering with the initial bowel cancer, I took my mobile phone with me, and it was texting and ringing pretty non-stop, which I'm thankful for, and it kept me on my toes. And then when she'd come and visit me in the hospital, I would give her worm orders worm orders to dispatch all over the country, down south and to Bridlington, and tell her the addresses they were going to, and show her in my diary where they were, tell her what the amounts were. And then after visiting me in hospital, she would have to come home, get in touch with the bait diggers, get them to get the worms, and then she would have to pack the worms up, ring round a courier, get in touch with the different shops, and send the baits all over the country, down south to Poole, over to Bridlington, or wherever else was required. So without her outstanding graft and work, I would not have had a worm business to come over to. So I'm deeply, deeply indebted to her, and have to thank her for all the hard work she did, even though she had the trauma of driving to the hospital daily and driving back home and running the holiday flats and running the house and running the worm business to keep it going. Even some of the shop owners, when they rang her, used to say, you know, you're 1 in a million, how can you do this when your husband's seriously ill in hospital? But in fairness to her, she got her head round it, and the business is still running today, even though I'm in this serious state of health. There's a family reunion which is actually tomorrow on Saturday, the 4th of November, and the reason I want to mention this is because in days gone by, my family, which consisted of 4 sisters and 2 brothers, was raised in Fairy Street in Fleetwood, and when the whole family grew up, they got married and they were brought up at this end of town, and they raised their families at this end of town. They all had children, and then when the children got to a certain age, the 4 sisters and the 2 brothers both removed themselves to the new end of town on the outskirts of where they were raised to raise their own families. And it transpired that 3 of the sisters, Barbara, my mother, Margaret and Cynthia, organised family reunions on each Boxing Day of each year for the next 20 years, which entailed all the families going, including Tom and his wife, the eldest brother. However, I don't know the exact reasons why, but Dorothy and her husband and Ernie and his wife were not invited to these family reunions. So it was the 3 girls and Tom and their children. And what used to happen was every Boxing Day, the whole of the family would get together. A cold buffet would be put on at tea time. All the family would meet and discuss everything about what they'd done in the year, and then in the evening they would retire to the Broadway Club and have a few beers. These reunions went on for about 20 years until the early 80s, and then for whatever reasons they stopped. Maybe it was cost, I'm not too sure, but they stopped. That's the first part of this story. The second part of the story is that after I'd come down with cancer, I went to a funeral on the 5th of December 2016, which was my uncle Billy Snape, who was married to one of the sisters, Margaret. And after the funeral service at Carlton Crematorium, there was a buffet meal in Carlton Bowling Club. When I arrived there, I was surprised to see a lot of young people there that I did not know of their identities. I discussed this with some of my older cousins who were there, Susan, Christine and Michael, and they also did not know the identities of these younger children. So it came to be that we discussed the old family reunions from Boxing Days gone by and decided there and then to have a family reunion to find out who these children and young adults were. So I left it with my two...
Wait, stop. Sit, like you need to lower yourself.
I left it with my two younger cousins, Christine and Michael, to sort out. Fast forward to the 7th of July, and when I went to the hospital to see the doctor who had operated on me, I was given my bad news that the cancer had returned into my lung, my liver and my stomach, and he gave me the bad news that I'd probably got 18 months to 2 years left to live. So armed with this information, I then started going around friends and family relatives to give them this bad news. I went to see one of my older cousins, Susan, told her my bad news, at which point she said she wouldn't be living much longer because she had difficulty in breathing and walking and was subject to go on dialysis treatment because she'd only got 2 small kidneys and would probably hit the box before me because of her illnesses. And then shortly after that, she turned around to me and said, "Oh, by the way, David, what's happening with the reunion?" I told her absolutely sweet bugger all, at which point she said to me, "Well, why don't you get off your big fat arse, you're retired, and get it sorted out?" Duly chastised, fast forward, and it's almost the 4th of November tomorrow, which is Saturday, and I've organised a reunion, and much to my surprise and everyone else's, having contacted all my older cousins, there are now going to be 64 in attendance at the reunion, and this will be the first family reunion of the Christy family as it was for nearly 40 years. So I'm quite pleased to get that off the ground, and this will be the subject of the evening will be the report on another video at some stage later in the year. So I'm quite pleased with that, as are all my cousins. The second thing I want to mention is I have never known who my real father is. I was a war baby, and my mother, Barbara, had a relationship with an American serviceman, and all that I knew about him was that he was called George Bishop and that he was stationed at Wheaton Camp near Kirkham, and he was in the American services. I don't know if he was an airman or in the army, but he was certainly in the American services. And he was 20 years of age.
He was based at Wharton, not Wheaton.
Oh, sorry, he was based at Wharton, not at Wheaton, and that he was approximately 20 years of age. That's as much as I knew about him. However, my daughter Laura, who is now 26...
I'm 25.
25, has hounded me since she was 15 to ascertain who a real American grandfather is. Now, I've always refuted any advances she'd made to identify him because, as I've said to her on many occasions, in my time in the 50s and 60s when I was a young child, my mother never told me anything about my father, and it wasn't for me to rake up the past and create problems for my mother about this relationship she had, plus the fact she'd got married to my stepfather, Johnny Dunn, and I'd got 2 stepsisters, Barbara and Andrea. So because...
Stop a minute. Half sisters?
Well, half sisters then, but because my mother had never discussed my father or anything about him, and because he'd never made any attempts to contact me, I never bothered questioning her about the origins of my father, because in those days, if you questioned your parents, you usually got a wang round the ear hole and was told to be quiet. So it wasn't an issue for me. However, it has been an issue for my daughter, and she's hounded me to track down the real George Bishop and his identity and where he's come from. So we get to the point of March 2016, when I did come down with this illness, this cancer, and I did agree, because of her persistence, to give her a DNA sample, which was sent to a laboratory in California, and eventually the DNA sample traced many bishops in Central America.
North America.
In Central North America, and my daughter Laura got in touch with a lot of these bishops via email and the occasional Facebook, and it transpired that the majority, in fact all of them, were either third, fourth or fifth cousins displaced. So although there was a connection on the DNA, it was by no means a close connection. It just proved history and ancestry, and the fact that we were related, but way down the motorway, nowhere near, anywhere near closeness or proximity to being true and real family. However, one of these people had just retired from the American Air Force. I think he was high up, a lieutenant or something. Or anyway, he was high up in the Air Force, and he suggested to Laura, my daughter, that she make contact with...
It wasn't him. It was... So through my research...
Well, just leave it as it is a moment. And it was... She was given the address of a War Archives Museum in St. Louis in Missouri in America, and that if she contacted them and sent them details of any information she had, then it was quite possible they could trace my father and his whereabouts. So armed with this information, she then wrote a letter to the Archives Department in St. Louis, and an agent was actually assigned to investigate the case with the sole intention of finding out my father's identity. After several months, he wrote back to Laura the fact that he'd actually traced him. He'd traced his service record, he'd traced his place of birth, he'd traced where he was buried at, he'd traced who he married, and everything to do with his war record, where he'd served. He had served at Wharton, and he was a member of a large salvage team who repaired aircraft and used the spare parts to rebuild aircraft for service in the European theatre of war in the Second World War in the 1940s. So, in fact, he actually said in his letter that he'd actually gone through 3,500 microfilm exhibits during the course of his search to identify him. It transpired that my father, George Bishop, had actually died in the year 2001 from a heart attack, aged 77, and the agent had actually written on the back of the envelope in pen, in his own handwriting, I only wish that you'd have tried to contact your relative earlier, which was a nice thing for him to say, even though he died 16 or 17 years prior to this inquiry. Nevertheless, armed with all this information and the service records, Laura then had a light bulb moment, because although no children or other relatives were identified in the investigators, in the agent's report, she googled George Bishop's name and date and place of birth and death, and in the records was the details of the girl he'd married, so she also googled that person's full name, i.e. maiden name as well as married name, and also her date and place of birth and death, and Google threw up the fact that there were actually two brothers and a sister that George had. They were his children, and therefore obviously they were related to me and were in fact my half brothers and half sister. So this set another investigation role on her on her shoulders, and at this point she then started to contact other cousins that were related to the children and got positive feedback from all of them. They were aware of the relationship between my mother and George, and they were also aware that I had been born and was subject of the relationship. It was a well-known fact amongst a lot of the cousins on one side of George's family. However, his own children were unaware of the relationship and were unaware of my existence. Maybe he'd not told them, but they certainly were unaware of it. So when Laura actually contacted them by email, they were quite shocked, and I don't think they were too ready to accept my existence and my relationship to them. So much so that two of them actually agreed to submit DNA samples, and they have now come back.
Only one brother did.
Right. One brother actually agreed to a DNA sample and submitted it, and it came back something in the region of like 2,650 marks on the scale, which revealed that he was a mere 50 short of being 100% related to me. So the fact remains that the DNA has definitely proved that we are related and that we are brothers. That is an incontrefutable fact that we are in fact brothers. So after all hard work, I've actually christened her DCLHC. And for those of you who don't know what that means, I was on CID at Fleetwood for many years when I was in the police. I spent 16 years on CID as an investigative detective, and she's obviously inherited some of my investigation techniques, and the LH, the DC stands for Detective Constable Laura Harold Christy. So if you want to refer to her as that in any conversations that you have with her, I'm sure she'll be quite pleased with that. But she's done a good job. She's worked hard at it, and it's obviously paid dividends because she now knows who her grandfather is. She knows that he was brought up in a town called Lebanon. He was a PE teacher for the American state system, and taught things like basketball and baseball, and was very highly thought of and did a good job. He was a good training teacher, so much so that there's actually, I think, a sports field named after him somewhere in the area where he was raised in Lebanon. So that's another piece of information that fits in with the story. The idea is that should I improve from the disease that I've got, the cancer, then at some stage in the year 2018, between January and March, it's possible that I will go to America and meet my two brothers and my sister, and also take some of my children with me, including Laura and the guy that she's going to marry, Rich, to meet them and find out where my father was born, where he's buried, where he taught at, and any other background on him. So that's another positive thing that's happened as I come close to the end of my life. The final thing that I'm going to mention now is, because of my terminal illness, my wife Diane mentioned to Laura several months ago that if she was thinking of getting married, she'd better do it sooner rather than later, because of the situation with my illness and the fact that it was terminal and the fact that I'd only got a certain amount of time to live. So much so, Laura and partner Rich have now designated the 14th of April for their wedding at Pilling in 2018. So that's another occasion that I've got to look forward to, and I've got the speech to write for that now.